Hello everyone, welcome to this channel. Today I'll be reading The Crimson Moth or The Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. I apologize if I said her name wrong. Everyone just kinda skipped past saying her name or quickly said it, so I don't know how to properly pronounce it. Sorry. Anyways, this is my first time ever doing something like this, and I'm really excited to see where this will take me. I only recently started to actually enjoy reading, and so I want to share my love for reading through this now. Let me know if there is anything I can do to improve. I'm open to all feedback. Disclaimer, if I do mispronounce anything, just ignore it or let me know. Without further ado, here is The Crimson Moth by Kristen Ciccarelli. For those afraid to be who they are. Overture. When the blood guard suspects a girl of being a witch, they strip off her clothes and search her body for scars. During the Sister Queen's rule, witches wore their casting scars with pride, putting their power on display like jeweled rings and silk garments. Scars signaled wealth and rank, and most of all, magic. Now they marked the hunted. The last time Rune laid eyes on a witch's scars was 2 years ago, after the witch queens were murdered in their beds and the blood of their council flowed in the streets. The blood guard seized control of the city and the purgings began. It was sunset when a surging crowd gathered at the center of the fog-soaked city. Rune stood among them, unable to unsee the thirsty, fevered looks around her. The people wanted vengeance, wanted to gulp it down like a rich red wine. The girls shrieked overhead as the old witch stumbled up the steps to the purging platform. Unlike those who came after her, the crone neither wept nor begged for mercy, but met her fate with a stoic glare. The blood guard ripped one sleeve from her shirt, revealing the evidence of her crimes. Patterned scars flowing down her left arm, etched like delicate white lacework against her golden skin. Rune couldn't help but find them beautiful. Once a sign of superior status, the scars were now impossible to hide, making the old woman easy prey for witch hunters. It was why Rune never cut herself. She couldn't afford to let them find the scars. 1. Rune. Mirage, the lowest and most basic category of spell. Mirage spells are simple illusions held for short periods that require little blood. The fresher the blood, the stronger the magic, and the easier casting will be. From Rules of Magic by Queen Calidora the Valiant. Lightning snaked across the sky as Rune Winters made her way through the wet forest, barely sheltered from the rain by the pine canopy overhead. Her lantern's glow lit the path before her, its surface broken by twisted roots and pools of rain water. It was a terrible night for casting. The rain seeped through her cloak, the dampness loosening the spell marks she'd drawn on her wrist in blood. She needed to redraw the symbols before the rain washed them away entirely, taking her magic with them. The illusion disguising Rune had to hold until she knew for certain Seraphine wouldn't kill her. As a former advisor to the sister queens, Seraphine Oakes was a powerful witch, and after 2 years of searching, Rune had finally tracked her down. Now that she had, what would she find at the top of this wooded headland? Friend or foe? Rune worried her lip with her teeth as she remembered her grandmother's last words to her 2 years ago. Promise me you'll find Seraphine Oakes, my darling. She'll tell you everything I couldn't. After the blood guard arrested Nan and dragged her from the house, they smeared a bloody X across the front door, declaring to everyone that an enemy of the Republic had been found within and was on her way to be purged. The memory of that day stabbed like a knife. An anxious hum buzzed in Rune's blood as she continued onward, like an overture growing louder and faster. If Seraphine saw through the illusion cloaking Rune before hearing her out, she might expel Rune from her house, or worse, strike her dead. Because wherever Rune Winters went, her carefully crafted reputation came with her. She was an informer, a witch hater, a darling of the new Republic. Rune was the girl who betrayed her grandmother. It's why she disguised herself as an old peddler tonight, leading a mule laden with goods. The smell of wet donkey hung in the air, and her load of pots and pans clattered with the beast's every step, each detail summoned into being by the magic in Rune's blood and held together by the symbols drawn on her wrist, binding the spell to her. It was a mirage, the most basic of spell classifications, and yet it had taken all of Rune's mental energy to cast. The resulting headache still roared in her temples. The branches shook with rain. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the tiny cottage perched at the cliff's edge where the forest ended. The windows glowed warmly with lamplight, and Rune could smell the wood smoke pluming from the chimney. With her spell marks fading fast, the illusion flickered around her. She needed the spell to hold for a little longer. Setting down her lantern, Rune withdrew the glass vial hidden in her pocket and uncorked the lid. Dabbing the blood inside the vial onto her fingertip, she held her wrist to the lamplight and retraced the symbols, reinforcing them. One altered her appearance, graying her hair, wrinkling her skin, hunching her shoulders, while the other summoned the manifestation of the mule beside her. The second she finished, the spell roared in her ears and the taste of salt bloomed on her tongue. The illusion snapped back into place, its bindings to Rune strengthened, and the pain in her temples throbbed harder. Swallowing the briny tang of magic, she pulled her hood over her hair, gritting her teeth against the worsening headache, then picked up her lantern and stepped out of the woods, continuing down the path toward the house. Mud sucked at her boots. Rain pelted her face. Her heart felt like it was going to thump right out of her chest. Whatever happened when that door opened was now in the hands of the ancients. If Seraphine saw through her magic and cursed her dead, it would be no less than Rune deserved. And if she showed mercy, Rune bit her lip, trying not to hope. Moving through the yard, she heard the anxious whinny of a horse from the silhouetted stable, probably frightened by the storm. When she reached the house, she found the front door already open and a triangle of golden light spilling into the yard. Her stiff fingers curled against the brass ring of her lantern's handle. Was Seraphine expecting her? Some witches foresaw snatches of the future, though these days it was rare, often fickle ability. Nothing like the clear-sighted prophecies of the powerful sibyls of old. Perhaps Seraphine was one of these. The thought made Rune straighten her shoulders and force herself onward. If Seraphine had foreseen this meeting, she knew who Rune was and that she was coming. All the more reason to get this over with. Leaving the mule illusion behind in the yard, she stepped across the threshold of the house. No one stood waiting for her. A fire lay dying in the hearth, the embers flickering red, and a plate of food sat on the table, the gravy congealed as if it had been sitting for a while. The rain spitting in through the open door dampened the stone floor beneath her feet. Rune frowned. "Hello?" Silence answered her. "Seraphine." The house moaned at the sound of its owner's name, the beams creaking overhead and the walls shifting in the wind. Rune glanced around, looking for any sign of the woman who lived here. The tiny house contained only a single room, with the kitchen in one corner and a small study in the opposite. "You must be here somewhere." A roughly hewn ladder in the center of the room led to a loft. Stepping onto its rungs, Rune climbed to the top, where she found an unmade bed and 3 lit candles dribbling honey-colored wax onto the floorboards. She climbed down and checked the only other door at the back of the house, which led into an empty garden. There was no sign of Seraphine. Rune's skin prickled with unease. Where is she? The horse whinnied again in the distance. The stable, of course. If the creature had spooked, Seraphine would have gone to calm it. With her lantern in hand and her headache still pulsing in her skull, Rune stepped back across the threshold and into the rain, leaving the door ajar, collecting her mule illusion as she went. Rain splattered her wrist and the spell lurched around her, trying to hold. Hurrying, she was halfway to the stable when something squished beneath her boot. It was difficult to see in the dark and the storm, so she crouched low and set her lamp in the muck. It was a garment. Rune reached for the sodden fabric. Rising to her feet, she studied her findings in the lamplight. A plain woolen work dress, the kind a servant might wear while scrubbing floors. Except someone had sliced the back open. Why would... She glanced at the part and saw a second piece of clothing. Stooping, she discovered a cotton shift, brown with mud, also sliced down the back. No, thought Rune, her rain-bitten fingers tracing the frayed edges. Not cut, torn. Her stomach tightened. With her wrist so exposed to the elements, the rain smudged out her spell marks completely, and the illusion sloughed off. Her headache vanished with it. Before she could fix the marks, a sudden wind rose, growling like an angry wolf. Slam! The door to Seraphine's house banged shut. Rune dropped the woolen dress and spun to face the door, her breath catching in her throat. Closed, the door gave her a full view of the bloody X smeared from corner to corner across its wooden surface. The mark of the blood guard. Seraphine wasn't in the stable calming her horse. Soldiers had found her, stripped her, and taken her with them. Nan's oldest friend was in the hands of the blood guard, the most dangerous place for a witch to be. 2. Rune. Rune raced Nan's tired horse, Lady, through the fog-laden streets of the capital. Electric lamps lit the way, their white light buzzing as they illuminated the closed shops flanking her on both sides. Lady's galloping hoofbeats on the cobbles contrasted sharply with the surrounding quiet. 2 years had passed since these streets ran with the blood of witches and the Republic of the Red Peace was born. Rune had spent those 2 years searching for Seraphine Oaks, determined to fulfill her grandmother's last request. The regime had executed all of Nan's witch friends, seizing their holdings and inheritances. The sole friend who'd escaped the purge was Seraphine, but only because she had been sent by the former queen into exile nearly 2 decades ago, and no one had seen her since. Now, on the night Rune finally found her, witch hunters had gotten there first. Was it a coincidence? Or was someone onto Rune? She supposed it was bound to happen, but now she would need to be especially careful. If someone within the blood guard suspected her, she needed to throw them off her scent. Rune tried not to think about the bloody X on the door or the torn clothes left in the mud. She knew exactly what had happened to Seraphine. She'd seen it firsthand on the day the blood guard came for Nan. It had been Rune who invited them. Immediately after the uprising, soldiers rounded up every known witch and purged them. The New Republic's army had taken control of the harbors, ensuring no one could leave the island. They seized Nan's ships, and it was only a matter of time before witch hunters came to Winter Sea House to arrest her. But Nan had a plan. Her old business partner had a fishing boat and was smuggling witches off island. The boat left from his private cove at midnight, and there was room for both Nan and Rune aboard the small craft if they could get there in time. Back then, Rune was only 16 and hadn't yet come into her magic. It had never crossed her mind that she would, since her birth parents hadn't been witches, and only witches begat witches, though magic sometimes skipped children and even generations, making it hard to predict. Rune's parents had drowned in a terrible shipwreck when she was a baby, leaving her an orphan with no family to take her in. So Nan had adopted her. But it didn't matter that Rune wasn't a witch or related to Nan by blood. Under the Red Peace, it mattered that Rune hadn't turned Nan in. When the blood guard came for her grandmother, they would declare Rune a sympathizer and execute her alongside Kestrel Winters for the crime of not turning in a witch. This was their only chance to escape. Rune was hurriedly packing her things when a message arrived from Alexander Sharp, her oldest friend. "Someone's betrayed you," it read. "The Blood Guard know your plans. Soldiers seized the fisherman earlier this evening and are waiting for you in his cove." But the news in Alex's message got even worse. "The roads leading out of town are closed off and they're arresting anyone who doesn't have permission to be traveling." There was nowhere to run. They were trapped in Wintersea House. They could hide, but for how long? "You need to report her, Rune, before it's too late." The message was clear. If Rune didn't turn Nan in immediately, they were both going to be executed. Refusing would earn Rune a brutal death, but Nan was her grandmother, the person Rune loved most in the world. Turning her in would be like carving out her own heart and handing it over. So she brought the note to Nan, trusting her grandmother would know how to get them out of this. She remembered the look of steel in Nan's eyes as she read the note, but instead of coming up with a new plan, she said, "He's right. You must report me immediately." Horrified, Rune shook her head. "No, there must be some other way." Nan pulled Rune into her arms, holding her close. Rune could still remember the smell of lavender oil dabbed behind Nan's ears. "My darling, they'll kill you if you don't." Rune wept and ran to her room, locking herself inside. "If you truly love me," said Nan from the other side of the door, "you will spare me the agony of watching them kill you." Rune's eyes burned with tears, her throat choked on sobs. "Please, darling, do this for me." Rune squeezed her eyes shut, wanting to wake from this nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. These were her choices. Turn her grandmother in, or die a grisly death at her side. Hot tears spilled down her cheeks. Finally, Rune opened the door and came out. Nan squeezed her in a fierce hug. She stroked Rune's hair the way she used to do when Rune was a child. "You must be very clever now, my love, clever and brave." With Elizabeth's help, Nan put Rune on a horse and sent her galloping into the night. Rune remembered the biting wind and pelting rain, remembered the way her body trembled. The night was freezing cold, but the fear in her heart was colder. She could have refused to do it, could have marched straight up to the soldiers and handed herself in instead of Nan, but she didn't, because deep down, Rune didn't want to die. Deep down, she was a coward. Drenched and shivering, Rune stumbled into the Blood Guard headquarters and spoke the words that would doom her grandmother. "Kestrel Winters is a witch planning to escape," she told them, forsaking the person she loved most in the world. "I can take you to her, but we must hurry before she gets away." She led the Blood Guard straight back to Wintersea, where they arrested Nan, dragging the old woman out of the house while Rune watched, silent and still, holding everything in. It was only after the soldiers were safely away that she collapsed to the floor and wept. Rune had spent the past 2 years trying to make amends for that night. But Nan was right. Turning her in had proven Rune to be as loyal to the New Republic as the rest of them. more loyal even. After all, what kind of person betrayed their own grandmother? A person who hated witches above all else. It was a ruse the lives of countless witches now depended on. Rune's trembling hands squeezed Lady's reins, and the leather strips bit through her deerskin gloves as she scanned the foggy streets of the capital. If she was lucky, the Blood Guard would detain Seraphine at a holding location. The guard would wait until they hunted down a few more witches before transferring them to a palace prison together. If Rune was unlucky, the thought of an alternative Seraphine already imprisoned beneath the palace, waiting to be purged, made a sick feeling surge in her stomach. Rune pushed her horse harder, trying to outrun it. That's what she needed to learn tonight, whether Seraphine was alive, and if so, where the Blood Guard was keeping her. As she and Lady arrived in the city center, a massive domed structure arose out of the gloom, rivaling the palace in magnitude. The Opera House. There would be witch hunters within, not to mention tribunal members. Some of them were bound to know where the new holding location was. The Opera House's copper-domed pavilion, where carriages dropped off patrons, came into view first. 5 massive columns, each one rising to 5 stories in height, bordered the pavilion. It always surprised Rune that the good commander allowed it to remain open. Shortly after the revolution, patriots ransacked the opera house, stripping off much of its previous splendor. Paintings, statues, and other decor harkening back to the reign of witches were smashed, burned, or thrown into the sea. But the interior, with its gold leaf and red velvet seating, remained a stark reminder of the decadence of the witch queens. As they entered the pavilion, Lady slowed to a trot, and an elderly stable hand stepped forward from the entrance arch, dressed in a trim black uniform. Rune dismounted. As her silk flats hit the stone walkway, her legs nearly buckled beneath her. Every bone in her body hurt from riding so hard to get here tonight. Citizen Winters, you're mighty late this evening. Rune winced internally at the familiar voice. She preferred the younger stable hands to this old patriot. The young ones stood in awe of not only Rune's wealth and connections, but her reputation as a hero of the revolution. Carson Merker, however, remained unimpressed by Rune, and his low regard unsettled her. Did he suspect her, or was he just a miserable old man? The opera's half over. At the disapproving tone of his voice, Rune stepped into her role. Pushing back the hood of her fine wool cloak, she took out her hair, letting it fall in a sea of rust gold waves. I prefer to miss the first act, Mr. Merker. It's so tedious otherwise. All you really need to know is how it ends. Who cares about the rest? Indeed, Carson said, narrowing his eyes. One wonders why you go at all. He turned to lead her horse toward the opera stables. Not liking the edge in his voice, she called after him. For the gossip, of course. The moment he was out of view, Rune anxiously tapped the secret pocket sewn into her gown, where her vial of blood lay hidden. Comforted, she forced the curmudgeonly stable hand out of her mind and entered the opera house, where members of the Blood Guard would be gloating about their recent capture. All Rune had to do tonight was keep her ears open and ask the right questions, and by the time the curtain fell, she'd have the information she needed to save Seraphine. She passed several children begging for coins or food on the way in. By the marks carved into their foreheads, she could tell they were penitents, the descendants of witch sympathizers, meaning someone in their family had refused to inform on a witch or had hidden one from witch hunters. Instead of executing or imprisoning the descendants of witch sympathizers, the good commander carved the penitent symbol into their foreheads, letting everyone know what they'd done. It was a warning, a way of dissuading others from helping witches. Rune's fingers itched to dig into her money pouch and drop several coins, but it was illegal to directly aid a penitent, and with Carson nearby, she didn't dare. So she only smiled a little. The children's echoing smiles twisted her heart with guilt as she passed them by. Inside, Rune discovered Carson was correct. The opera was half over. Before her, the ceremonial staircase, divided into two divergent and interwoven flights of steps, was mostly empty. But the cacophony of voices coming from the grand foyer far above was an unmistakable sign that intermission was well underway. Pressing her hand to the cool marble balustrade, Rune pushed the penitent children out of her mind and started upward. She felt aware of the men around her as she ascended the stairs, their attentive gazes lingering on her long after she passed, reminding her of a recent conversation she had with her friend, Verity. "Don't you think it's time you picked one?" A suitor, she meant. One of the many eligible young men who lined up to take Rune's dancing ribbons at balls invited her out on romantic dinners and took her on long carriage rides. It wasn't Rune who tempted them. Sure, a few might genuinely be interested in the pretty face she presented to the world. Most, though, were after Nan's fortune, her profitable shipping business and her vast estate, all of it gifted to Rune by the New Republic for her heroism during the Revolution. Rune had been stringing the useful ones along for over a year, all from well-connected families with access to secrets she needed. Secrets she often get them to spill in dark corners and shadowed alcoves. But she couldn't keep doing it forever. Their patience was limited, and Rune couldn't afford to make enemies of them. Verity had made a list of the most valuable suitors and left it on Rune's pillow the morning after their talk. She would need to choose one, and she needed to do it soon. But not tonight, she thought, hurrying up the steps. Tonight she would mingle with the sons and daughters of the Revolution, stealing whatever secrets she could. When Rune arrived at the top of the interwoven staircase, the grand foyer stretched out before her, full of opera patrons dressed in muted silks and frothy lace, with cream-colored pearls strung through their hair, all of them illuminated by a dozen pairs of winking chandeliers hanging down the massive hall. "Rune Winters," came a voice that stopped her in her tracks. "Sneaking in late, I see. Out on a tryst with one of your lovers?" Several scandalized giggles followed. The voice belonged to Verity de Wilde, Rune's best friend. Verity stood beneath the lights with her hands on both hips and a playful smile tugging her mouth. Wispy brown ringlets framed her white face, and her eyes were dark behind her spectacles. She wore a dress the color of sunflowers, with white lace sleeves and a low-cut back, one of Rune's hand-me-downs from the last season. It had originally been sleeveless, but since sleeveless dresses were out of fashion now, Rune had enlisted her seamstress to add them before gifting it to Verity. Flanking Verity was a group of their fashionable friends, young men and women who dined at Rune's table and danced in her ballroom hundreds of times, and would do so again tonight at her after-party. Friends was perhaps too generous a term, since not one of them would think twice about turning her in if they knew what she was. Or perhaps, came another voice, causing everyone to turn, Rune has been out rescuing witches all night. They say the Crimson Moth only works beneath the cover of darkness. The words chilled Rune, who looked directly into the piercing eyes of Lila Creed. Lila was several inches taller, which made it seem like she was looking down her nose at Rune, and a member of the Blood Guard. She was also beautiful, with prominent cheekbones and raven black hair crowned high on her head. Rune recognized the design of the high-waisted peacock blue dress. It was the work of Sebastian Kahn, a popular dressmaker from the mainland whose waitlist was almost a year long and whose dresses were the envy of the season. It was impossible to acquire one unless you had considerable wealth and connections. Rune had two in her closet. The fact that Lila wore the rare dress and not her uniform meant she was off duty tonight. She likely hadn't been one of the witch hunters who'd brought Seraphine in. Rune's blood ran cold at the memory of Seraphine's empty house, of how the Blood Guard soldiers found the witch right before Rune showed up. If she was being spied on, the spy could very well be Lila, who had never liked Rune for reasons she could only guess at. Donning her mask, the one she hid the true Rune Winters behind, Rune threw back her head and laughed. Ha! Can you imagine it? Me? Spending my nights gallivanting across this damned island with its ghastly weather and endless mud and rain? Think of what it would do to my menus. She pulled up the hem of her skirt to show off the silk shoes custom made by Evelyn Minu, a couture artist halfway across the world whose designs were one of a kind and never replicated. It had taken half a year for Rune to get in touch with her and another year for the shoes to arrive. Take that, Lila Creed. At the looks of astonishment and envy, Rune dropped her hem and, smiling, entered the circle forming around her, stepping a little in front of Lila to edge her out. Lowering her voice, a little conspiratorially, she said, "Did you hear? The vigilante smuggled her last batch of witches out through the sewers. The sewers! Just think!" Their noses wrinkled with disgust. Rune didn't need to fake her reaction. Her stomach twisted at the memory of it. The putrid odor of raw sewage filling the dark tunnel, sloshing around her knees as she and the twin sisters she rescued, they were barely 13, walked through the stench for miles beneath the city. A servant had found their bed sheets hidden beneath the floorboards and informed the girls. The bloodstains weren't red, but black, the telltale sign of a witch who'd come into her powers at the onset of her first bleeding. That night, Alexander Sharp, the same friend who had tipped Rune off to the blood guard closing in on Nan, had been waiting on the other end with fresh clothes and a horse that would take the girls directly to the docks where one of Rune's loaded cargo ships was ready to set sail. Alex was always waiting on the other end, sometimes with horses or carriage, other times with boats. He was the getaway man in their heists, and he never let Rune down. The cargo ship arrived in port 2 days ago, and the twins had sent a coded message saying they were safe on the mainland. Anyone who prefers wading through poo to sleeping soundly in a soft, clean bed is, well, revolting. Growing warm beneath her cloak, Rune untied the tassels at her throat. The surrounding party murmured their agreement, except for one person, Lila. But isn't that precisely what the Crimson Moth would say? Rune's fingers stiffened as the tassels of the cloak came undone. The garment slipped from her bare shoulders, and before she could grab it, someone stepped behind her, catching the fine wool and folding it over his arm. "Come now," said a comforting voice near her ear. If Rune was the moth, would she have delivered her grandmother to be purged? As the owner of the voice stepped beside Rune, she glanced up. Alex Sharp. In the presence of her oldest friend, a genuine friend like Verity, every muscle in her body relaxed. He looked like a lion tonight, with his golden hair shining beneath the light of the chandeliers. His gaze was warm and steady on her face, but his forehead creased ever so slightly, saying he knew where she'd been and he'd worried about her. Noah Creed, Lila's brother, and a young man who'd made Verity's short list of suitors Rune needs to consider, cut in. "The Crimson Moth hasn't struck in weeks," Noah said, also defending Rune. To support this theory, he added, "I heard they brought in another witch tonight, completely unhindered. The moth didn't even try to rescue her." Rune's attention homed in on Noah. "Where did you hear that, I wonder?" Noah shared his sister's deep brown eyes, high cheekbones, and ochre skin tone. Not only was he handsome in his black overcoat with sloping shoulders and silk lapel, but he was also the son of the good commander. That position put him very close to a first-hand source of the most classified intel, making him a fine option indeed. But will he notice his wife slipping out of bed in the night, or coming home exhausted after dawn, sometimes with bruises? Rune turned her smile on Noah. "A witch? Brought in tonight? Don't tease us, Noah. Tell us more." Noah's eyes widened at finding himself the subject of her attention, but he lifted his hands in protest. Gideon Sharp brought her in. That's all I know. Gideon Sharp. Rune's lips nearly curled at the name of Alex's older brother. Devoutly loyal to the New Republic, Gideon was a ruthless, bloodthirsty witch hunter who'd sent more of Rune's kind to the purge than any other member of the Guard. He'd also famously helped assassinate the sister queens, sparking the revolution into a blaze. Rune hated him. The two Sharp brothers couldn't be more different. Catching Rune's gaze, Verity raised a dark eyebrow, asking a silent question. In answer, Rune tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, showing off her grandmother's ruby earrings. She put them on earlier tonight, and they dripped from her ears like beads of blood. The earrings were her answer. Failure. Telling her partner in crime everything she needed to know about how tonight went. Seraphine is in enemy hands. Either Verity would figure out the rest herself, or Rune would fill her in before the after party she was hosting later tonight. At the sight of the rubies, Verity's mouth pinched. Turning away from Rune, she quickly cleared her throat. "Well, I've always thought Mrs. Blackwater is the moth," she said, commanding the group's attention as she glanced across the loud, brightly lit hall toward an old woman with frizzy hair and a neck strung with too many pearls. Mrs. Blackwater sat alone on the Opera Cafe's terrace, murmuring to herself, "Can you imagine the old biddy leading the Bloodguard on a wild goose chase? What a perfect disguise." At that, everyone burst out laughing. As more guesses were made, Rune took the chance Verity gave her and slipped silently into the crowd, armed with a new purpose, tracking down Gideon Sharp. 3. Gideon. Another night, another witch. Gideon Sharp pressed his fists against the shower tiles. Letting the hot water scald his back, he stared blankly at the blood running like ink down his skin and swirling around the drain. He couldn't tell if the blood was real or imagined. The nightmares were no longer confined to his sleeping hours. They often struck in the middle of his waking ones now. But this was no nightmare. He knew whose blood this was. It was as real as he was. You shouldn't have left them alone with her. The Tasker brothers had a lust for disobeying orders, and though Gideon himself had no love for witches, he didn't tolerate unnecessary cruelty. He wanted to discharge the brothers the last time they bludgeoned a witch half to death, but had been told by his betters that beating a witch senseless was no different from beating a disease-ridden rat. So the abuse continued. Tonight was just one more occurrence. And what are you going to do about it? Gideon closed his eyes and turned his face into the steaming hot water. A problem for tomorrow. Right now, he was too tired to think, too tired to move from this spot. It had taken him nearly a year to track down the high-profile witch he'd brought in tonight, and he'd ridden hard to get her. He'd prefer not to see a saddle for another week at least, but he'd agreed to meet Harrow, one of his sources, at the opera tonight. It was Harrow who tipped him off to Seraphine's whereabouts, and she had news of the Crimson Moth, the perpetual thorn in Gideon's side. Gideon was desperate to hear it. The thought gave him renewed motivation. Rubbing the bar of soap between his hands, he scrubbed his weary body with suds, washing all over until he came to the brand seared into his left pectoral, a rose with knife-like thorns half enclosed inside a crescent moon. Her brand. Despite the heat of the shower, Gideon shivered. The youngest sister queen might be dead, but she'd marked him forever. Gideon often thought about cutting it out, just to be rid of every last effing trace of her. But digging the brand out of his skin wouldn't carve the memories from his mind, or rid him of the flashbacks, or soften the nightmares. It didn't matter. Every time he got out the knife and put the honed edge to his skin, his hands shook too much to do the job right. So, for now, it stayed. The thought of her made him wonder if the spirits of particularly evil witches could live on past their deaths, returning to haunt those they'd tormented while alive. He immediately wished he could unthink it. Gideon turned off the water, eyeing the steamy room around him as the cold air rushed in, raising the hair on his arms and legs. "She's dead, you fool, and there's no such thing as ghosts. Cressida might be dead, but there were equally dangerous witches out there. 3 nights ago, another mutilated body had been found dragged under a bridge, chest ripped open, blood drained out. Gideon wasn't surprised when he learned it belonged to a blood guard officer. They always did. It was the 3rd one this month. Gideon couldn't prove the Crimson Moth was committing the heinous acts, but he had a strong hunch. The murders usually took place right before she struck, breaking his charges out of their prison cells and escaping his ever-tightening security. To do that, the moth needed spells, and spells required blood, fresh blood. Which of us next? Running his hands over his face, Gideon shook the water from his hair, grabbed a towel, and dried himself off, directing his thoughts somewhere else. Anywhere else. The opera. Yes. Good. He would go over tonight in his mind, and the preparation would banish the eerie chill in his bathroom. First, Gideon would button his tired body into a uniform and drag himself to the opera house. There, while some useless story played itself out across the stage, Harrow would tell him what she'd learned about the moth. And finally, Gideon would come home, devise a plan while falling into bed, sleep dreamlessly, or so he hoped, and resume his hunt for the fiend upon waking, armed with new information. And this time he would catch her. But first, Gideon needed to get through a night at the opera, an activity even less tolerable than trudging through the mud and rain on horseback, hunting down a witch. The only good news was he was going to miss the first half. 4. Rune. Here in the foyer, the blood guard stood out like red poppies in a meadow. Their uniforms were impossible to miss, even in the brightly dressed crowd. But not a single one was Gideon. Maybe he's not here tonight. If Alex's elder brother had indeed brought Seraphine in, he might still be processing her, or possibly taking the rest of the night off. Rune couldn't stop herself from wondering if it was Gideon who'd ripped the dress off Seraphine and forced her to stand naked in the rain while he and his soldiers raked their eyes over her body, searching it for scars. Her teeth clenched at the thought. Gideon Sharp. She loathed him. As Rune's rage simmered like a red-hot coal, she moved skillfully through the crowd, presenting a smiling, happy face, commenting on new fashions and hairstyles, or the delightful dinners of the New Republic's well-to-do that she attended last week, never lingering long, all while constantly looking for the next scarlet uniform. She passed her usual marks: Blood Guard affiliates, daughters and sons of tribunal members, people who not only were well connected, but enjoyed flaunting those connections and, in doing so, unwittingly giving information away. Their conversations droned in the air like bees drunk on pollen. The chandeliers overhead lit the ceiling, which was painted with a blue-black sky full of stars. a rendering that had been allowed to remain untouched in the revolution's aftermath. There were 2 salons on either side of the foyer, and along the wall, behind the columns lining the room, were several small alcoves for more illicit meetings. Rune was headed toward the salon where Blood Guard members often gathered, when a hand grabbed her wrist, pulling her out of the crowd and into one of the shadowed alcoves. Spinning to face her accoster, she found golden brown eyes peering at her from beneath tawny brows. The tension bled out of her. It was only Alex. Rune, his fingertips pressed against the sensitive skin of her wrist as he drew her deeper into the darkness. You look like you're prepared to walk into hell itself. Rune had the sudden urge to rest here with him a while, where it was safe, before throwing herself back into danger. What happened tonight? He coaxed. Rune shook off the urge, remembering her mission. Did you hear Noah? Your brother happened tonight, she said, annoyed at the thought. Gideon got to Seraphine before I did. Alex frowned. So you... A chorus of voices, one of them Lila Creed's, echoed nearby. On instinct, Rune drew Alex deeper into the shadows until they were nearly chest to chest. She wasn't worried about someone seeing them in here together. They'd simply assume it was exactly what Verity had pretended to accuse Rune of having earlier. A tryst. What she worried about was being overheard. They both fell silent, waiting for the voices to pass. The tip of Rune's nose was less than an inch from Alex's chin, and the smell of him, like leather and oak, filled the air. The small space seemed to shrink around them, and for a moment Rune remembered the night she turned Nan in. Alex had raced to Winter Sea, then held her through the night while she wept. You worry me, he whispered close to her ear. His voice was careful, soft, as if Rune were made of glass and he needed to handle her with caution. You spend your days looking out for everyone else, but who's looking out for you? You're looking out for me, she whispered to his double-breasted lapel. Not to mention Verity and Lady. Lady is a horse, he countered, and Verity throws herself into as much danger as you do. He seemed about to say something else when the bells signaling the end of intermission chimed through the foyer. Rune stepped away from his familiar, steady frame and glanced out of the alcove. A column blocked most of her view, but she could see Lila's black hair braided into that fashionable crown heading towards the doors of the auditorium. The drone of conversation was already dwindling. In a few minutes, the foyer would be empty and silent, and Rune had yet to find Gideon. She refused to let tonight be a waste. She needed Seraphine's whereabouts. Is your brother here? She whispered, scanning the emptying foyer like a hawk, searching for the plumpest field mouse. I don't know. I haven't spoken to him all week. Why? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Alex knew the thoughts in her head. Rune, no. My brother is a danger. He gently gripped her bare shoulder, turning her to face him. To you especially. Your brother is a danger to every witch in the New Republic. She tugged herself free of his hand. Seraphine, especially. If I don't find out where he's put her. Didn't he understand? She didn't know where Seraphine was or when they planned to transfer her. For all Rune knew, she might already be en route to the palace prison, and if she was, I'll never get her out. They'll kill her like they did Nan. Once the blood guard brought a witch inside the prison, Rune couldn't save them. The prison was impregnable. And if I don't save her, I'll fail to do the last thing Nan asked of me. It was unacceptable. Rune, what other choice do I have? She said, coming back to him. You won't do it. As loyal as Alex was to the Crimson Moth, to her, he drew a line at his brother. Under no circumstances would he ever manipulate Gideon the way he, Rune, and Verity manipulated the rest of their peers. Rune had asked him once and watched his bright gold eyes dim. His uncharacteristically sharp answer, absolutely not, stopped her from asking again. Rune knew Alex had helped kill the youngest sister, Queen, Cressida Roseblood. He never spoke of it, except to say that he had done it for Gideon, at which point he turned the conversation to other things. Rune didn't know what that meant. Had Gideon asked him to kill Cressida? Had he forced him to? Or had Alex done it to save his brother somehow? The latter, if true, struck Rune as odd, since Gideon was the violent one, a natural predator. Unlike his brother, Alex was warm and kind and scorned the killing of witches. Not to mention, he was devoutly loyal to Rune. The problem was, he was equally loyal to Gideon. Sometimes Rune suspected he was more loyal, but for some strange reason, it didn't make her trust him less. She knew in her heart Alex would never betray her. He would just never betray his brother either, which often put them at odds with each other. Once, Rune might have understood Alex's devotion to his brother. Years before the revolution, Rune had wanted to earn Gideon's approval. Alex was her closest friend back then, and though Rune hadn't met Gideon yet, she'd heard stories about him. Biased stories she knew now told by Alex, who worshipped his older brother. Young, naive Rune had believed the stories, and the more of them Alex told her, the more she felt she knew Gideon. She soon developed what some might call a crush. It was important, therefore, that she make a good impression the first time they met. In retrospect, the whole thing was childish and absurd. When they did meet, Rune was 13 and Gideon 15. He not only refused to shake her hand, he outright insulted the outfit she was wearing, a dress she'd selected for the sole aim of impressing him. When Alex asked Gideon to apologize, he refused. Alex's stories were wrong. So wrong. She learned that day it was the one thing he couldn't be relied upon for, accurate judgment of his brother. Gideon was a beast of a boy, and Rune never cared to win his esteem again. I'll cast an illusion, she told Alex now, her fingers tapping the corked vial of blood concealed in her dress. Blood she'd collected from last month's bleeding. He won't know it's me. Except Rune had only one full vial left after this. Once it was gone, she would have nothing until the start of her next monthly cycle. She needed as much blood as possible to save Seraphine. Alex shook his head. He'll smell the magic on you. Gideon's not one of your money-eyed suitors, Rune. So I'll invite him to my after-party, where she could keep his cup full of enchanted wine and probe him with innocent questions that would lead to the answers she needed. He hates parties. Rune threw up her hands and hissed, Then I'll think of something else. She turned her back on Alex and was about to walk away when his strained voice said, I'm sick of watching you walk into danger. She paused, sighing, and stared out into the empty foyer. Then don't watch. Rune didn't wait for him to respond. She stepped out of the alcove and straight into a blood guard's uniform. 5. Rune. Her forehead collided hard with a chest as solid as concrete. The force of the soldier's stride would have barreled her over had he not grabbed her elbow, steadying them both. Forgive me. Rune looked up, straight into the eyes as black and cold as a bottomless sea. Gideon sharp. His penetrating gaze seemed to cut her open, peeling back the layers of the girl she pretended to be, like a knife carving off the protective skin of an apple to get at the soft, vulnerable flesh beneath. Rune's stomach tumbled over itself. She yanked her elbow out of his grip and staggered back, her heart beating fast. The blood guard captain before her, responsible for sending more witches to their executions than any other soldier, straightened, his features shifting from startled surprise to something dark and unreadable. Rune cursed herself. The Crimson Moth might have reason to cower from this monster, but Rune Winters, the silly, shallow heiress she pretended to be, wouldn't think twice about it. Before she could find her courage, Gideon's gaze ran sharply down her. The force of his attention was like a rifle aimed at her heart. It made her pulse race and her breath stick in her throat. Rune was a deer and he was a hunter. Taking her measure, noting every detail and flaw, trying to decide if she would be worth the hunt. A second later, he frowned and looked away. Evidently, she wasn't. Citizen Winters, my apologies. Gideon's incisive gaze flicked over her shoulder, drawn to the sudden movement of his younger brother emerging from the alcove. At the sight of Alex, his rigid form relaxed. Gideon stepped around Rune as if she were not only disappointing but entirely forgettable. Alex, what's the matter? You look perturbed. What? Oh. Alex shook his head. Nothing at all. Must be the terrible lighting. He motioned to the gas lights glowing on the walls. Gideon cocked his head, unconvinced. Alex quickly changed the subject. When did you get back? This evening. The two brothers were inverse mirrors of each other. They had the same tall frames, handsome features, firm jaws, prominent brows. But where Alex was golden and warm as a summer day, Gideon was closed and dark as a locked windowless room. The two brothers were also the sons of the Sharp Duet, a pair of lovers who started as humble tailors during the reign of witches. When their work caught the eye of the sister queens, Alex and Gideon's parents were recruited by the Roseblood family to become the royal dressmakers, launching them to short-lived fame. Both died the same year, right before the Revolution. Anyone in fashionable circles still fell reverently quiet whenever someone spoke the dressmaker's name. "And?" Alex was saying, his voice a little strained. "Was your hunt successful?" Gideon sighed and ran a hand roughly through his damp hair. "Despite an unfortunate incident, yes, we have the witch in custody." "He's speaking of Seraphine." Rune felt her mask slip further as she remembered the torn clothes discarded in the mud. Had he and the others laughed as they stripped the garments off the woman's back? She thought of the red X smeared across Seraphine's door, knowing whose blood he spilled to mark it. Like a deer shaking off the paralyzing fear of its hunter, Rune reached for her voice, ironing out the hatred before speaking. "What kind of unfortunate incident?" Gideon glanced over as if surprised she was still standing there. He paused, reconsidering her. This time, Rune studied him back, letting her gaze roam over him. The fit of his red uniform hinted at a hard, efficient form beneath. No softness, no warmth, just unyielding muscle and strength, like an impenetrable fortress. He had a strong, cruel mouth, and his black hair was still wet from the rain, or possibly a shower. And though he must have run himself as ragged as she had hunting down Seraphine, he stood before her polished and clean, from the pistol at his hip to the brass buckles on his boots, making Rune wonder if he had scrubbed off the blood with the same precision his parents once sewed their elaborate garments for the queens. The only disorderly thing about him were the knuckles on his right hand. They were red and raw as if from pummeling something or someone. Rune's blood burned beneath her skin. Afraid he would see the fury in her eyes, she peered up through her eyelashes, knowing the effect it had on other young men. "I dearly hope you weren't harmed in this incident." He seemed about to answer her when the sudden final chime of the intermission bells cut him off. All three of them looked to find the grand foyer transformed around them. Without the socializing crowds, its emptiness loomed large. The chandeliers overhead suddenly seemed too big and too bright, and the painted ceiling more magnanimous than their insignificant selves deserved. The ushers began turning out the gaslights, casting annoyed looks in their direction. Beyond the auditorium doors, the orchestra started to play. Taking the hint, Gideon began backing away from his brother. "I have a ring booked for tomorrow night. Want to go a few rounds?" Alex nodded. "Sure, that would be nice." Before turning, Gideon glanced from Alex to Rune to the alcove they had both come out of. His lips parted ever so slightly, and something dawned in his eyes. Whatever it was, he kept to himself and strode off. Alex blew out a breath. Rune swore quietly. She had let him intimidate her and found her courage too late, blotching her chance to get the information she needed. Her hands curled into fists. She only had so much time before they transferred Seraphine to the palace prison. Smoothing down her gown, she replaced the snarl on her face with a sweet smile, preparing to slip into the role she'd grown so good at playing these past 2 years. Seeing it, Alex reached for her. "Rune, don't." She stepped out of his grasp. "Rune!" He didn't follow as she stalked after his brother. Her silk shoes barely made a sound on the mosaic floor of the foyer, giving Gideon no inkling that he was being tracked. For now, their roles had reversed. Rune was the predator, he was the prey, and she was closing in on him. At the far end of the hall, where the arches of the loggia framed the foggy city outside, Gideon turned and headed up a staircase, one that led to the box reserved for Blood Guard members. A moment later, Rune followed. Hitching her skirts, she ran up the steps, shoved aside the velvet curtains at the top, and stepped out onto the darkened balcony and into a sea of red. It was teeming with witch hunters. Rune hesitated. She was the Crimson Moth, a wanted criminal, not to mention a witch hiding in plain sight. But this wouldn't be the first time she had walked into a space full of people who hunted her kind. She'd done it hundreds of times before without batting an eye. So why was there a tiny seed of fear sprouting inside her? Because Alex is right. In a war room full of weapons, Gideon was the deadliest, and Rune was heading straight toward that honed edge her throat bared. He doesn't suspect you, she told herself, trying to calm the buzz in her blood. All these stupid brutes see when they look at you is exactly what you want them to see. A silly little socialite. Gideon Sharp is no different. Armed with this reminder, Rune headed toward the empty seat at the front of the box. Beside it, Gideon reclined, elbow resting on the backrest, perfectly relaxed, as if Seraphine's impending execution didn't plague him at all. Rune gathered her courage the way she gathered her dress. Sitting down beside him, she said, "Mind if I join you?"